Hello, welcome to the first lecture on the topic of memory. I believe this is chapter 8 in your textbook. Memory is kind of a fun chapter. It's a topic where I have several activities for you in the Canvas shell, and I like to think of it as probably the most useful chapters. So I'm going to broad stroke it again, or big picture, and hopefully offer some tips as to how you can use your memory practically and perhaps understand why some people's memories are better than others. Okay, so we need to talk about what the purpose. The purpose of memory is to acquire, retain, and retrieve information, right? And I like to say that memory and learning are basically the same thing, right? What is it when you learn? You're forming memories. When you remember something, you are effectively learning about, a place or a time. There are three things three processes of memory. Your memory is basically wrong, right? So more than not, our memory is considered incorrect. But how many times do we get in arguments over, I remember it this way and somebody else remembers it another way? We believe our memories are more correct than they are. And the reason that they are so very fallible is because there's effectively three places that your memory can go wrong. Encoding is defined as the process of actually getting something into your memory, and we can simply fail to encode it, right? I believe there's an exercise in the Canvas shell, encoding failure, and that demonstrates how easy it is to encode information or misencode information where we think something's there and it's really not, or we think that something wasn't there and it really was there, right? So you have encoding failure, and there's lots of reasons. Interference, you simply didn't pay attention, you forgot where you put your keys when you came in from work and you put down the groceries in your book bag. You didn't really forget where you put your keys, you simply never remembered where you never encoded it, right? Storage, sometimes we can put stuff in the wrong place. I like to think of storage a little bit like closets, right? That it's in that closet somewhere, but you just can't find it. So it's kind of how our memories are. It's in there somewhere, you just can't get to it. And I think of the metaphor that the more stuff you have in there, the more disorganized. So it can be useful to think about a system of encoding it and storing it in the right place. And then the third one is you simply can fail to find it, right? It's in there, so the retrieval. And our memory retrieval systems are a bit problematic too, right? We can just simply fail to find it when we need it. There's a couple different models, right? So for our purposes in this chapter, I want to talk about these different models of memory, the way that it sort of works. And the stage model theory says that the process of forming memories goes through these three different stages of storage, I guess would be. So we have like a sensory memory, right? Which is really what does your slide say? It says registers much, but stores very little. And this is where sort of we're in the moment, right? These are the images and the sounds. Is this the one that tells about the example of that were images? So an example of how your sensory memory would work would be like if you're watching this video, right? The video is not it's not flowing, it's just a series of pixels that are blinking. But it looks like it's moving because we have this overlap, this sensory overlap. Or music is much the same way, that words sound connected, sounds sound connected, but that's only because we have this delay in your sort of sensory memory, right? So there's lots of things going on and we're processing them and remembering them, because they connect with the next sensory message, but they're not going to be there. We're not going to remember the conversation, even though we heard the conversation, right? Then you have your your short-term memory. And sometimes your short-term memory is thought of as your workbench memory, right? So this is the one that processes much and stores, as they processes much but stores little. So this is where we bring all of our information, all of the memory information that we're going to use, but only a little bit of that is actually going to get kept for a long time, right? So you remember having a conversation with a friend, but by the late end of the afternoon, you really only remember maybe 2 bits of information from that. Though while you were having the conversation, you remember the whole conversation, right? Then you move to your long-term memory. And this is typically when we say memory, this is typically what we're thinking of. And the long-term memory is the one, what does it say? It says that content flows to and from. So a better way, a good way to think about how all 3 of these memories work together is to think about a conversation and you're talking with a friend, right? And your long-term memory is what stores, you remember that person's name, you remember the person's pets, you remember what you talked about last week, right? It's your work. So you bring all of that information and you remember the spoken language, and you remember all the rules about, you know, being polite and taking turns and asking questions and listening. So when we come to a conversation with an old friend, we bring all of that old stuff to the short term and we put it all on the table or the workbench, and we rearrange it in the course of our conversation. And it's the sensory memory, and then we're using our sensory memory to listen to the words, to connecting the words and the sounds that they just made. So maybe you've heard when folks say, oh, you're really only using 10% of your brain or 10% of your memory. That's psychologists say that's not true, that we use lots of our memory all the time, right? But our concept of what our memory is sort of, it's just based on one sort of set of memory. So people will say, I have a bad memory. Not really, you're just not giving all kinds of memory the same credit that you give your long-term memory. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about your sensory memory, right? So we think about sensory memory as being what they call visual or iconic, right? Iconic, so you might remember that. That could be a quiz question. And then we have econic, right? Like our ears are econic. And your visual memory is actually shorter, right, than your hearing, than your econic memory. So the way you can sort of conceptualize this visual memory is the rubber pencil experiment. And I think you pretty much have to use like a really wooden pencil to do this. But if I were to, you know, flat my pencil, it might look kind of rubbery. Well, that's not very, oh, there you go. Now it's kind of looking rubbery, right? And it's not rubbery, but the reason it looks like that is because you have your visual memory is actually seeing that it's very short, and it's seeing that image in multiple places. Or like I said with the video or a TV screen, we see images as if they are moving, but they're really not. They're really just pixels flying at us. Another example is how you can write with a flashlight or write with a sparkler, right? Those light particles are actually not in multiple places, but because there's this memory overlap, it looks like they're in multiple places, right? So there's this, yeah, our visual memory. And then the econic memory, that's the one that I think is kind of fun to talk about. If you've ever had that experience where you didn't hear someone, right? So your roommate goes to the kitchen and you say, hey man, can you bring me a soda? And then your friend says, huh? Right? And then you hear it. This happened I remember when my kids were small, you know, everything I said to my daughter, she'd be like, huh? 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 And I just got to a point where I'm like, I just wait, because she would eventually hear it, right? So you remember something that was just said to you like after the fact. And this has to do really with processing, but you didn't, quote unquote, you didn't hear it when it was said. You heard it later, if that makes any sense, right? You say your roommate goes to the refrigerator and says, what? I didn't hear you. Give it a second, and then they heard you, kind of thing. Okay, so your short-term memory. There's a couple important concepts, and really the best way for me to explain any of this stuff about memory is to do it in the context of activities, right, or of illustrations. And I want to stop right here, I think, and when I start up in the next 10 minutes, I want to offer you some examples of short-term memory. In the meantime, between now and when you start your next, ask yourself, can you remember your old high school locker combination? And do you remember your student number from high school?